This video is going to go out to UK Christian 28 and D Lukens 9. And UK Christian 28, I did actually watch your video. And D Lukens 9, I'm going to start with you first. Okay. Now, there are a lot of people that I have met recently, actually in the last 3.5 years. You wouldn't believe the lack of intelligence these people have. We have the junior higher that doesn't know that a dime is worth 10 cents. We have the high schooler that doesn't know how an on-off switch works on a light switch. We have people that have gotten out of high school and they're no smarter than what they were when they came in, except the fact that they can speak a few more words. That's about it. Trust me. I don't know who you've been dealing with, that you need to come out of your lab and you need to start meeting the people I've been dealing with. You'd be really surprised at what I'm dealing with. You'd be in absolute shock. So, get out of your lab, start talking to people I'm talking to, and then maybe you'll understand why I do what I do. Now, let's go with a different context here. Furthermore, you say rational conversation. Yes, this is the same rationality that John the Baptist used when he cried out in the wilderness to proclaim Jesus being the Messiah. This is the same rationality that Jesus used when he flipped over the tables of the money changers. Ask St. Paul about rationality. Ask St. Peter about rationality. Whoa. Yeah. So before you give me that kind of commentary, you might want to check about some of the irrational things that Christians did, even in the Bible. So there goes your rationality argument right out the pieces. Alright. So now I'm going to make a response to honest techno-atheists. Honest techno-atheist, either you've not had kids very long, or you don't have any kids. You have no concept of what you're talking about. You have the kid sit there one time and tell you he ain't going to eat nothing, he's going to rebel. And you're going to understand what I'm talking about in these videos. Nice long chat. Yeah, right. Yeah, you're going to understand soon enough, and then you're going to change your mind about a lot of things. So you can go kiss my butt on that one. All right, now UK Christian 28. You failed to bring up. You said, well, the Hebrew word here for son is yada yada yada. Okay, fine. You didn't bring up what happens to the daughters. What if you have a rebellious daughter instead of a rebellious son? You don't bring up any of that. You don't say that rebellious daughters didn't have hardly any rights. They couldn't own property, they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that. You didn't bring them up at all. I found that very lacking in your presentation. Oh, and you mentioned the word habitual behavior. If you had dealt with the kind of people I'm dealing with on a regular basis, you wouldn't use the word habitual. Or you would stand there and say, habitual means over and over again. It is a repeated pattern. Because these people have never probably heard of habitual, and even if they have no clue as to what that means. So you really have to, I'm not kidding, you have to literally stop and say habitual means over and over again or repeated behavior. Because if you don't, they are clueless. I'm not kidding you. I've dealt with enough people to tell you that one. Okay. Now, I do agree with your presentation. This was a punishment of last resort. Now, let's get the picture here. You actually had to have the mother and the father agreeing that this kid was a danger to them. You actually had to have the elders of the community also agree with that. Really? Let's think about this for just a second here. That many people agreeing on something? Yeah, look at our presidential campaigns. We're literally neck and neck. Yeah, try to get a whole bunch of people to agree on much of anything. It's really tough. So I agree there. And you were right. Back in that society, we're talking about people in the wilderness. They're wandering around for 40 years. Of course they're not going to have any established police or prisons. Yeah, they're going to have a wandering prison. Oh, we got a transportable prison. Or psychologists. Well, I suppose they could have psychologists, but nobody was trained in psychology at that time. Or hospitals. Yeah, that was a real trip. Or rehab centers. How you gonna transport that rehab center around the wilderness? Okay. So, yeah, you're right on all that. But I disagree with you when you say it was about drunkards. I think that word is terribly mistranslated. It should be translated intoxicated. What, they didn't know about opium back then? Egyptians knew that. And I'm sure even though they may have never called it ecstasy, or they may have never called it crystal meth or anything like that, I'm sure they had substances like that. And they were very easily obtainable in the wilderness. Okay? So, they're saying, well, these are just drunkards. I don't think so. I think they were far worse than that. Yes, some drunkards can get violent and disruptive, but I think that they were hooked on a lot more than alcohol. You didn't bring that up in your presentation. You probably should have. Okay? And you're right about the no insurance. Yeah, they didn't have exactly insurance agents going around. So yes, you were right about that. Now, the guy being disruptive. I'll get my marker hat here as I continue on my little discussion. The guy being disruptive. Okay, we're going to call this little guy A. Most likely it would have been the oldest son. Okay. He's disruptive because, number one, he's a gluttonous person. And you're right about them not having restaurants in the wilderness. That's true, they didn't. Okay, but even when they got into Jerusalem, they probably had very few restaurants, and even at that, it's probably such a costly thing to go to a restaurant that they probably wouldn't want to go there. Alright? Let me tell you something. If you had to spend $100 on a meal, which in some... Let's say you had to spend $100 at McDonald's just to get a hamburger. Did you really go there on a daily basis? I don't think so. So yeah, you're right about that. Okay, so we have a disruptive kid. His name is A. He's gotten hooked. Now, the thing is, if you're talking about being in the wilderness, how's he going to get the alcohol? Vineyards don't grow overnight. And even if the vineyards did magically grow overnight, how are you going to wine press them? Okay? So the real answer is that they were probably dealing with communities as they were wandering around in the wilderness. They were probably bartering with other communities. Alright? And even after they got established in Jerusalem, they were still dealing with outside communities. Because, like I said, vineyards don't grow overnight. And then you have to get the grapes down, you have to mash them up, you have to make the alcohol out of them. Alcohol doesn't just appear magically in a night. It doesn't work that way. So, I don't think this kid here was just drunk on alcohol. Okay, he might have been able to get a few bottles of whatever, but the thing is, he had to be intoxicated on something far more than that to be that disruptive. And yes, there were a lot of stuff readily available that could have made him that disruptive. So, you got this guy, he's hooked. That means he has to have a dealer. Now, there were no Hebrew dealers. The kid is spending the family fortune to get the drugs from this dealer. And don't tell me there weren't dealers back at that time. I know better than that. Now, if anybody knows anything about being intoxicating of this magnitude, this kid was probably hungry all the time. He's probably eating the people out of house and home, and he was spending the family fortune. But it got worse, because this kid was disruptive. He was disruptive to the work of everybody else. That's bad enough. But then he was trashing people's properties. Probably started with his families, and then probably went right on to neighbors in the community. He's probably trashing their property too. He was probably also so far out of control, he was getting ready to kill a whole bunch of people. Because let me tell you something, when you take those kind of trips, you're so out of it that you'll kill anybody. Especially if they tell you can't have any more drugs. Trust me. But then it gets worse. Now, guy A probably has friends. We now have guy B. Guy B and C here. Okay? Now, the dealer has been successfully giving a bunch of selling a bunch of drugs to A. But he doesn't have enough drugs for B and C, so now he has to employ his friends. So now you have Mr. Dealer and his friend in your community. So a whole bunch of undesirables are starting to enter your community now that you didn't want in your community in the first place. So now these guys are selling drugs not to this guy, but also to this guy and this guy. So now they're selling drugs to all three of these people. And it goes on and on, and the more people that get hooked, the more these people starts coming in the community. Now that becomes a real threat to the community. Alright? Well, finally, parents get to realizing all this. So they said, you know what? We got to get rid of kid number A. Because if we don't, we're not going to just lose this kid. Okay? We're not going to just lose kid A. We're going to lose kid B and C also. But it gets even worse. Because when the parents of this kid right here get impoverished enough, they have to start selling off their other siblings into slavery to pay for this kid's behavior. Something else you failed to mention in your video. So now kid A is creating a situation where the parents of kid A has to take his other siblings and sell them into slavery just so the family can survive. Well, finally, father and mother have enough. They go to the elders in the community and they say, look, we're having to sell our other kids into slavery because of this kid. This kid is now getting members of your other kids in your community hooked on drugs. This kid's got to go. So the elders of the community, they get rid of kid A. And they may also have to get rid of kid B and kid C. This is not a pleasant thing, I assure you. So now they finally get rid of kid A, B, and C. They find out that nobody else is hooked, so these dealers go away. Dealers will only stick around when they have customers. If they have no more customers, they get lost. And finally, this community starts to get restored. Okay, they finally get restored. Now, I assure you, when you get that many community members together, including the parents, stoning a kid, that's not a happy day. They weren't thrilled with that. They were very upset with that. That they would have to go to that much length to get rid of a bunch of kids because of this mess. So now, this kid is not only responsible for getting his younger and older siblings thrown into slavery, but he's also responsible for getting his friends killed. That's not a happy day. Now, the final point is that some will say, well, that punishment was never invoked. God would never mention a scenario like this if he did not anticipate this thing happening. It wouldn't have been necessary. So I think this really was done. How many times, we'll never know. But I think this really was done. Because God would not invoke a law in which he knew nobody would ever break. Why tell them a law like this if he knew they weren't going to break it? It'd be stupid. So therefore, I believe this was actually done. When, where, how, I'm not really sure. But I think this punishment was actually invoked at some point. Because God wouldn't have mentioned it if it didn't have to be done. It'd be stupid, and God's not stupid. God said that for a reason. And so therefore, I think this was done. You may not have the story behind it, but I'm sure it was done. Now, one final point. God himself invoked this punishment. You say, when? Remember the story of David and Absalom? Yeah. God finally sent Joab to knock off Absalom because he had become this rebellious. I don't know about being truly intoxicated, but he had become so rebellious that he was endangering the entire Jerusalem kingdom. Finally, God got rid of Absalom. End of story. So there you go. Rational? Reasonable? No. Now, you said community involvement. That was the last point you made in your video before you went off on some tangent. That's okay, you can go off on some tangent if you want. I don't think anybody's going to pay attention to it, but you can go off on a tangent. Community involvement. Okay. You're absolutely right. When that much of a community decides to kill off a kid, they finally remember why they had to do it. They're not happy about killing off a kid, but they knew it had to be done to save the community. That way they can teach their kids not to be like that kid. It becomes an object lesson. So yeah, community involvement was a very important thing. Alright. I think we've pretty much covered everything. Hopefully you enjoyed this presentation, D. Lukens 9, a little better than the last one. But if you've dealt with the people I've dealt with, you know why I had to do what I had to do. I had to wake them up. They're asleep. You have no idea how badly they're asleep. Trust me. Alright. I will tell you all more in a future video, so stay tuned.